Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our April Trade Policy Research Forum webinar. My name is Ben Shepherd. I'm here with my co-founder, Hannah Norberg. We've got a great session today. Hannah's going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. But while people are coming into the room, let me take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the Trade Policy Research Forum if this is your first time joining us. We're an online forum, and as you can tell from our logo, we try to bridge the gap in a number of ways. Our original objective when we started nearly 5 years ago was to bring something like a lunchtime seminar to a global trade policy audience and to bring experts from the global centers of trade policy to places where people might not have access to those experts on a regular basis. We also want to bridge the gap between the different parts of the trade policy profession. Hannah and I are both economists, but both of our speakers today are lawyers. We've had public policy professionals, we've had policy specialists, we've had practitioners. All of these people make up the trade policy community, and it's of course very important that we all know how to talk to each other, how to engage, and importantly, how to listen as well. So that's another gap that we try to fill. This started as a pandemic project, but I'm happy to say that we've had a ton of interest along the way. So if you'd like to follow what we do, the screen that you get at the end of the webinar will be the sign-up form for our mailing list. Please do follow that through and sign up for the mailing list. That's the best way of keeping in touch with what we're doing. We also have a LinkedIn group. We have over 4,000 members on the LinkedIn group. So it's a great place to start a discussion. If you have a research paper, it's a great place to post the paper and get comments. And of course, it's somewhere where you can continue the discussion today. So that's what we're trying to do with the forum. Let me hand over to Hannah to introduce today's session.
Thank you so much for that, Ben, and thank you so much, Henry and Juan, for being here today. We were just saying before we started that we are so spoiled, Ben and I. We get to do this every month. We get to think of interesting things, and then we get to reach out to the smartest people we know. And they usually say yes and come join us, and today is no different. So two things in terms of housekeeping rules. Number one is that we always run out of time. Always run out of time. So make sure that you start right away using the chat box or the Q&A and get your thoughts and comments in there and questions so that we can rope them into the conversation as we go. And number two is that let's start using them already and let us know where you're coming in from, because that makes the conversation even juicier, that we know who you are and what you're interested in and where you're coming in from. And then join the LinkedIn group so you can continue the conversation. And as Ben said, sign up. So without further ado, but we usually make this super short because we want to be very mindful of the time that we have here. So we have Henry Gao, who is a professor at Singapore Management University and a well-known expert on China, and Huan Zhu in DC. So thank you, Henry, for staying up late for doing this. And Huan Zhu, who runs the China Trade Monitor together with Simon Lester in DC. And we're going to start it off with Henry giving us an overview of the US-China situation, and then Juan will talk a little bit more about the domestic situation in China and the EU. So I'm just going to cut it short right there and hand it over to you, Henry.
Thank you, Hannah and Ben. So it's my pleasure to join this webinar. So let me first of all start by sharing my screen. I think, Ben, you are sharing your screen. So if you can release the screen so that I can maybe...
Yep, you should be able to share.
Okay, great. Now it's working. Yeah. Okay, great. So it's my pleasure to join this webinar. So my remarks, which will go for about 25 minutes, are actually primarily based on two very recent articles I just published last week and this week. So the first one is called The Art of a Trade Deal, How Trump's Reciprocal Tariff Agreements Can Reset the Global Trade Agenda, published in Commonplace, which is a journal run by the think tank American Compass. And then the other one is China Can't Go It Alone, which was published earlier this week in the Tablet magazine, based in New York. So basically, from these two articles, I aim to address three questions today. The first question is, what is the Liberation Day tariffs is about, especially regarding China? And second is, what has been China's reaction so far? And third is, how do we get a win-win solution between the US and China? So as we all know, on Liberation Day, roughly 3 weeks ago, President Trump announced universal tariffs on all countries, only to pause them a week later. Though controversial, this move was not about tariffs per se, as I argued on my Twitter X account, but more about creating leverage so that the other countries would all rush to negotiate with the US, as we have seen happening over the past 3 weeks. Basically, the US, through this method, have managed to launch the largest round of trade talks since the Doha round that was launched in 2001. And the end goal of this trade negotiation, I would argue, is to have a new generation of bilateral deals that go beyond just tariffs to reshape global trading system. So I would expect these new agreements to address three issues: tariffs, non-tariff barriers, or NTBs, as those of us who are familiar with WTO jargons would know, and also finally, but certainly not the least, measures on China. First, on tariffs, the US is likely to lead with a kind of a 0-for-0 offer by eliminating tariffs if the partners agree to do the same. So realistically, I would guess that a few countries would match full elimination of tariffs, except Singapore, of course, because Singapore already has zero tariffs on virtually everything. So negotiations would center instead, I think, around the US average pre-Liberation Day tariff of 3.4%. Now, that is still a significant win for the US, because the US basically, through this, would manage to lower global tariffs with minimal or no concessions on the side of the US, and therefore no need for approval from the Congress. Second is non-tariff barriers. Now, these are often more damaging than tariffs and cover a wide range of issues, ranging from customs delays to licensing red tapes to digital restrictions to weak IP restrictions, weak IP protections, as actually mentioned by Trump in his executive order. The US already has a framework for this in the reciprocal tariffs executive order, as I mentioned, and the flexibility of the new agreements would allow the US to tailor the NTB agenda to each trading partner. For example, for advanced economies like the EU or Australia, I would expect the US would target things like over-regulation, things such as high technical standards, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and also data localization requirements or restrictive rules on cross-border data flow that pose problems for US exports. For developing countries, on the other hand, I would expect the US to emphasize the streamlining border procedures, upgrading labor and environmental standards, and also reducing other barriers such as corruption and so on. So these would basically prevent a race to the bottom and opens their markets to American goods. While the 90-day timeline for negotiations sounds very tight, the US does not really need to start from scratch, because it can pull directly from many of the existing trade agreements and texts. For example, the TPP, the original TPP that Trump pulled out in 2017, already has language on state-owned enterprises, digital trade, and procurement issues, and these are all aligned with longstanding US standards. Likewise, the USMCA, the agreement between US, Mexico, and Canada that Trump negotiated to replace the original NAFTA, offers strong labor provisions with rapid enforcement mechanisms. So these can be reused with minimal edits, creating consistent high-quality agreements very quickly. As more countries sign on, others will be likely to follow, so the incentive is quite clear. The earlier you sign a deal, the earlier you would have access to the world's largest market. But this effort is not just about rules or tariffs. It's also about China. And I would argue, actually, it is mainly about China. Everybody, in that sense, is just a collateral damage in the US effort to contain China. Now, the US argued that Beijing has had a long history of gaming the system. And actually, this is what we have seen partly after the first trade war when Trump launched this in 2018. So basically, China was able to avoid the 25% tariff by rerouting goods through third countries, shifting production to other countries to sidestep US tariffs, and even sometimes falsifying origin documents. So how should the US deal with this? Now, I would argue the first step would be supply chain realignment. The US needs new rules of origin, like something like the yarn forwarding rules in the TPP for textiles that would exclude inputs from non-TPP countries such as China. So these rules can be expanded to electronics and autos, which rely also on complex multi-country supply chains. Now, to encourage the shift away of production from China to other countries, I would expect the US also allow accumulation across its trade partners. So if a product uses inputs from Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, the combined value would count towards tariff preference. Now, this is because it is highly unlikely for one single country to replicate the massive manufacturing capacity China currently has, and therefore multi-country collaboration is necessary. This will encourage firms to shift their production base from China to these allied countries of the US. But in addition to this, which I would call a carrot, there probably would also be some sticks. For example, if Chinese content in this final product exceed a certain percentage, let's say 20%, I would expect that there could be some sort of mechanism to do the opposite of accumulation, which I would call subtraction. That is, that amount, that Chinese content can be subtracted from the regional value calculation, potentially disqualifying the product for preferences and these new trade agreements. Now, this dual approach, rewarding collaboration and penalizing Chinese dependence, would shift supply chains and tighten enforcement. To make this work, the US would also need robust transshipment monitoring. If a trade partner failed to prevent illegal Chinese rerouting, that partner would face automatic penalties, tariffs that scale with violation. Here, I would like to mention that actually I wrote this suggestion 2 weeks ago, and then last week, the CBP actually confirmed this by introducing really rigorous new system for origin verification, where if the origin is misrepresented, and then the shipper could be subject to a penalty as high as 300%. I expect something of this sort to be found in many of these agreements that the US is signing. Finally, how could the US do all this in 90 days? Well, I would argue that the US actually does not need to negotiate with everyone. Instead, it can pick anchor partners, one or two from each region or representing each type of countries, and fast-track talks using template agreements. Once those are finalized, other countries can join on a take it or leave it basis. I would say that the US should prioritize countries not just by trade volume, but by strategic fit. Are they aligned with US security goals? For example, are they voting for or against US in UN Security Council resolutions? Do they manipulate currency or serve as transshipment hubs? Are there economies tied to China through the Belt and Road Initiative? Do they uphold labor, environmental, and various legal standards such as anti-corruption and so on? So such classification system could allow the US to develop a smarter, faster strategy. And once the model deals are in place, the US can move quickly before China has time to counter with its own pressure campaign. In short, Liberation Day wasn't about tariffs, it was about leverage. Now the US can use that leverage to reset global trade, cutting tariffs, dismantling barriers, and building a new economic architecture that excludes China's distortions and rewards fair competition. This is how the US contains China economically without really firing a shot. So the second issue I would like to discuss is how has China reacted so far? So as we have seen since the very beginning, the original 34% tariff against China on Liberation Day, China has basically responded in kind at each stage, matching every US hike, ultimately culminating in a 125% tariff on April 10th, which was mirrored by China the next day. And China has been eager to showcase its defiance. A coordinated propaganda campaign has accompanied its retaliation, with the People's Daily leading the charge. So the People's Daily actually published one widely circulated editorial on April 9th, I think, which is called "Focus on Doing Your Own Things," and it tries to downplay U.S. pressure by calling the tariffs abusive, by insisting that the sky cannot collapse. Because the editorial highlights several pillars of a supposed economic resilience. First is China's sheer scale and ability to absorb shocks. It claims that declining dependence on the US, with exports to the American markets falling from 90.2% in 2018 to 14.7% in 2024. It also points to asymmetric dependence. While China is diversifying, the US remains reliant on Chinese intermediate and capital goods, with some sectors showing over 50% of dependency. China's growing trade with ASEAN and the Belt and Road countries is also emphasized by the editorial, with ASEAN bond exports rising from 12.8% to 16.4%, and BRI exports jumping from 38.7% to 47.8% during the same period. Domestically, the editorial claims that 85% of Chinese exporters also serve the internal market, with 75% of the revenue coming from domestic sales, suggesting a buffer from external shocks. But I think actually these claims do not withstand deeper examination. For example, China's exports to the BRI countries may have exceeded those to the US, EU, and Japan combined, as I noted in my interview with the Financial Times last year. But much of that is actually rerouted trade, as I argued then. The goods are simply repackaged or lightly assembled or falsely labeled in certain countries before being re-exported to the US. By the way, this explains why we find tariffs on remote places such as Heard Island and McDonald's Island, which actually reported a mysterious $1.4 billion worth of electronics and machineries shipped to the US in 2022, as reported by the BBC. So, even though many people laugh at the US measure for slapping tariff on Heard Island and McDonald's Island, I think there's a reason behind that. So the reported drop in direct export to the US likely overstates the real decline. In reality, I would say that if you add up all these transshipments, the volume of Chinese goods reaching the US may not have changed much, or it might have actually increased. The editorial also provides a rather rosy review of domestic conditions, citing stable growth, strong consumption, and resilient exports. But data released by China's National Bureau of Statistics last month tells another story. In the first 2 months of this year, they noted that consumption and investment remains weak. Household purchasing power was low, commodity sales were sluggish, and industry demand soft. Corporate profitability is under pressure, and exports of industrial goods face mounting headwinds. Foreign investor confidence is also collapsing. As Nikkei reported recently, China's inbound FDI has fallen by 99% over the past 3 years, reaching its lowest level in 3 decades. The editorial argues that China is better prepared this time because it had the experience of fighting the last trade war in 2018. Essentially, China appears to have drawn 3 main lessons from the last round of trade war. First, that tariffs can be largely offset. So last time in 2018, the US imposed a 25% tariff. China responded basically by devaluing the renminbi by roughly 10% and slashing some production costs, basically so that they can keep prices stable for American consumers. Second, even though China didn't really fulfill most of its obligations under the Phase 1 agreement, China faced no significant penalties from the US under the Biden administration. So this reinforced China's view that it can sidestep commitments without meaningful repercussions. Third, that the broader economic fallout from the trade war was less severe than expected. So if you look at the post-trade war economic growth, China recorded an 8.4% GDP growth in 2021, the year after the Phase 1 agreement was signed. And that was actually the highest in a decade. Now, this has bolstered Beijing's belief that it can weather another tariff escalation with limited long-term damage. But I would argue, as I argue, are wrong lessons. First of all, the tariffs now, if you add up all the tariffs, 1 to 25%, right, for this new round of tariffs, plus the 20% for fentanyl, and then the original 25% in the first trade war. So total tariff for China is now as high as 170%. If you add to that, the other tariffs such as Section 01, Section 232, or anti-dumping tariffs, it could be as high as 245%. So with such high tariffs, devaluation is no longer a viable offset. Even if China just do an 85% devaluation, this would push the renminbi to 13 renminbi per US dollar, and this could easily trigger a financial panic and a crisis in China. Now, second, for the non-compliance issue, China faced no penalties for breaching the Phase 1 agreement, largely because the Biden administration essentially did nothing on the trade front during its 4 years in office. So if we recall, during Biden's 4 years in office, the US didn't sign any single trade deal, right? They didn't conclude any major trade negotiation. But Trump 2.0 is clearly quite different, with Trump more willing to retaliate, as recent weeks have shown. And third, the 8.4% growth from 2021, that is often cited as a proof of China's resilience. But I would argue that was just an anomaly driven by the COVID. So the reason why China was able to get a 8.4% growth in 2021 was largely because China reacted swiftly and strictly, when the pandemic first hit, much earlier than everybody else. So that is why China was able to get a high growth number. But that was short-lived. By 2022, growth has dropped to 3%. Just about the US, which is quite close to 3%. And there's a reason to suspect that official numbers in China are manipulated. So if you look at independent estimates, such as the one from the Rhodium Group, they would put China's real growth for 2022 as between minus 0.3% and minus 0.8%. And that is actually well behind the US. So this time around, China claims that it can counter US pressure through fiscal stimulus, citing a 4% deficit target and plans to support key sectors. But aggressive stimulus risks worsening China's structural problems. So the last time China had a major surplus was in 2008, at the wake of the global financial crisis. when actually most of the funds were channeled to state-owned enterprises, which resulted in further weakening the private sector and setting a stage for a 15-year continuous slowdown in growth. So basically, if you look at China's growth rate trajectory, after 2008, it has been on a downward trend. This was only interrupted by 2 years, which both happened during the COVID, and that was because of the COVID distortions that I mentioned earlier. And if you look at President Xi's recent speeches and so on, he clearly has a preference for SOEs over private and foreign businesses. So this makes it unlikely that this round of stimulus would be different from 2008. Instead, more likely, it will reinforce the dominance of state actors at the expense of innovation and competitiveness. The editorial also includes one new phrase, that is, I'll quote, boosting domestic consumption with extraordinary efforts. And this actually has gotten many people excited because it has never appeared in policy documents before. But here too, I would caution some skepticism, because Xi has long warned against creating a welfare state or raising lazy people. He doesn't believe in social welfare. So even if new progress emerge, they will more likely focus on channeling demand towards state-preferred industries like electric vehicles and home appliances, that is, to absorb surplus capacity rather than genuinely raising household incomes. And despite mounting pressures, Beijing has so far avoided major stimulus announcements. Since Trump's return to the political scene last November, China has largely kept its powder dry, potentially saving its fiscal response for a more severe shock. But when that moment arrives, it might be too late. Beyond economic measures, China has also expanded its legal toolkit. So since 2020, China has introduced a host of legal instruments, including, for example, the national security law, the unreliable entity list, the blocking statute, the anti-sanctions law, and the foreign relations law. These vague but powerful laws give authorities wide discretion to retaliate against foreign firms. And this is illustrated by one recent case where a foreign shipbuilder was ordered to pay renminbi 84 million to its Chinese partner after unsuccessfully citing third country sanctions to justify non-payment. The court ruled against the foreign firm under the new anti-sanctions law. So this growing legal assertiveness is already prompting firms like Microsoft to scale back operations in China. If this continues, China's increasing reliance on legal tools may further isolate it economically, just as its global integration is coming under renewed strain. On the international front, China is likely to use economic coercion to pressure countries away from US-led agreements, just like it has done in the past with Australia, South Korea, and Lithuania. This is confirmed by Xi's recent visit to Southeast Asia and MOFCOM's recent announcement that China will resolutely take reciprocal countermeasures against any country reaching a deal by sacrificing China's interests. But I would argue that these countries are hardly, willing partners of China. In 2024, Vietnam exports just 42% of what imports from China, and Cambodia's trade deficit with China account for 30% of its GDP. In other words, these countries all have huge trade deficits with China. On the other hand, these countries all enjoy quite large trade surpluses with the US, making it highly unlikely that they would side with China over the US. As a result, despite China's diplomatic push, it has failed to secure major concessions from other Asian nations. So in any event, to counter China's effort, I would expect the US new trade agreement to include something such as collective defense mechanisms, just like the anti-coercion instrument by the EU or the poison pill clause in the USMCA. Basically, the idea is that if China use economic coercion against any country, then all countries would respond jointly by raising tariffs, suspending trade, or supporting boycotted goods. So that would provide sufficient incentive against China. Additionally, I would expect the US to implement a coordinated safeguard mechanism. So if China diverts its exports to another trade partner to dodge the tariffs, then the other country would impose safeguards. And that is basically what you find, for example, in China's WTO accession protocol. My final point is about how we might move towards a genuine win-win solution. But before we go there, it's worth asking, how did we end up here in the first place? Let's rewind 25 years. In the 2020 speech on the China trade bill, President Clinton famously declared, by joining the WTO, China is not simply agreeing to import more of our products. It is agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom. The more China liberalizes its economy, the more fully it will liberalize the potential of its people. And when individuals have the power not just to dream, but to realize their dreams, they will demand a greater say. A quarter century later, the Chinese people clearly do not have democracy, but do they even have economic freedom? Well, this question was answered by late Premier Li Keqiang, who actually admitted in 2020 that there are over 600 million Chinese, roughly half of China's population, earning less than 1,000 yuan per month. And this worked out to be less than $5 a day. And this is not because the Chinese people lack talent, initiative, or work ethic. On the contrary, they are among the most entrepreneurial and hardworking people in the world. So what went wrong? Well, in truth, I would argue actually nothing went wrong. This is not a failure of the Chinese system. It is actually a feature of the Chinese system. By deliberately keeping the wages low, the CCP is able to maintain its control of the people while channeling surplus labor into its manufacturing export complex. And with the labor so cheap, nobody can really compete with China. And this isn't just a domestic issue. With China now producing 30% of global industrial output, but consuming only around 10% of the global total, the country must export its surplus capacity abroad. The result is what economists have called the China shock, a global wave of deindustrialization as markets are flooded with ultra-cheap Chinese goods. Unless China reforms its growth model by redistributing more of its economic gains to the people, this problem will not go away. The US may have launched the trade war, but others will follow if the current trends continue, as we have seen in the EU's recent demands for China to raise the prices for its exported electric vehicles. So how do we get out of this? Ultimately, the answer lies in China's hands. A genuine rebalancing would mean higher wages, a basic social safety net, affordable housing, and access to basic health care, essentially by treating the people as human beings rather than as disposable human flesh battery. Until the People's Republic truly becomes a republic for its own people, we cannot expect a win-win outcome for the world. And in that sense, maybe that would be the silver lining of this trade war. Thank you.
Thanks, Henry. That's a really interesting presentation. I think we're going to have lots to say about that in the Q&A. Let me hand straight over to Huan for her take.
Well, thank you, Ben and Hannah, for having me here. Henry really covered a lot during his presentation. There is not that many things for me to add here. So I just want to raise a few points about, China's relationship with the US and then its effort to foster a better relationship with the rest of the world. So recently, I got a lot of questions about, is there going to be a deal between China and the US? I think Henry kind of put it a not very bright future on that one, and I kind of agree. There are a lot of obstacles, for even the two sides to meet and pick up the phone at the moment. But even if we go through that stage, I think there are a few issues here. One is how we're gonna overcome the frustration with the phase one agreement. Both sides are not happy with the implementation of the phase one deal. Um, both USTR and MOFCOM were very vocal about that. And I think that for China, um, the hope was that I think there was a expectation for the having the phase one agreement will stabilize the bilateral relations, which didn't really happen in reality. So I think at the moment, the interest of having any kind of deal with the Trump administration, knowing that it won't really help much in the situation, I think that's one of the reasons that China may not be very excited about negotiating with the Trump administration. And then, if we talk about a deal, what can the U.S. offer, right? Because there are indications from the administration right now about rolling back some of the tariffs. Um, but we are going to, even if the Trump administration scale back its reciprocal tariff, or even like the fentanyl tariffs, we are still having ongoing Section 232, Section 301 investigations, and potentially lead to more tariffs. And while it's possible for other countries to negotiate some sort of exclusions with the Trump administration, China is, the least likely party to be able to get that kind of a deal. That means we're going to see more tariffs added to Chinese products. So on the offers the U.S. can put forward, not really much on tariffs that have a actual impact. U.S. still have other legal tools to impose trade restrictions, such as the executive order on security information and communications technology and services supply chain, which was signed by President Trump during Trump 1.0. So that has been used as a legal base to curb the imports of Chinese connected vehicles and softwares and hardwares. I can see that legal tools be used more to curb, future Chinese imports. And then on export controls, on sanctions, on two-way investment, we already see the early signs that the Trump administration indicated they're going to tighten these rules. So there are really not much the Trump administration can offer in order to make a deal with China. So if we are not going to see a lot of movement on the U.S.-China bilateral side, so what China's focus is going to be? Henry mentioned that China has really reached out to neighbors and beyond in search for alternative markets and political support. We saw China really urge UK, EU, Japan, and other countries to protect the multilateral trade system and trying to call for a united front against the US tariffs. It also trying to woo international firms and trying to leverage their influence to oppose tariffs. So whether these will work really, up for debate and remain an open question. But at least that's what China is doing at the moment. When it comes to its relations with the rest of the world, I think Henry mentioned the U.S. have a carrot and stick approach, and I think that's happening with China too. So domestically, China has really trying to liberalize its market in part because, as Henry pointed out, the FT foreign investment in China really fell to a 30-year low. And China just experienced a net outflow of FDI in last year. So part of China's effort to address that issue is last year it lifted all restrictions on foreign investment in the manufacturing sector, and then we start to see it opening up its service sector. So for China, the service sector right now accounts for more than 50% of China's GDP. But compare that to the data in more developed countries, the ratio is still low. So the Chinese government see there's a room for growth there. Uh, and but unfortunately, many of the sectors still remain closed or restrictive to foreign investment, and that's part of the effort we're seeing since last year and this year, right? When China started this negative list approach in its effort to liberalize the services trade, what that means is that unless it's explicitly identified by the Chinese government that this sector is closed or restrictive to foreign investors, the sector will be open. So that's the negative list approach. And we'll see that in government documents and recent FTAs that is signed with other countries. And I see this, China has been trying to accelerate the process. So instead of, because since it's still like slow process, what it's doing right now by opening up its services sector is that it launched this kind of pilot program identifying specific cities that will participate and then design, like open certain services sectors in that region and test the water, see what the impact is going to be. And then with the goal to expand it into a wider scope or even nationwide in the end. So last week, the Chinese government published a work plan to accelerate that process to open up its services trade. With right now, the focus is on telecommunication services, digital services, financial service, medical, Medicare, and a few other sectors. So we're gonna, it remain to be seen what the actual impact is gonna be on China's service trade and investment, because a lot of the impact really depends on the implementation details, but it's something worth paying attention to. And then in terms of building its alliance with its neighboring countries, Harry mentioned that Xi Jinping visited some of South Asian countries last week. And then we're seeing China having continued to push this effort to join the CPTPP and DIPA. Its accession to the CPTPP has been stalled, but with right now there are renewed pushes within China to at least work toward that direction. So one thing I've seen in the work plan that I mentioned issue last week, there are languages talking about in these pilot programs, they're going to voluntarily align some of the rules with the high standard rules under the CPTPP, especially when it comes to IP protection, environmental protection, labor protection. Now, we all know if you follow, the CPTPP and the whole dynamic there, we know there are still some obstacles for China to join. Data being one, although I don't think that's not I don't think it's impossible to overcome visual and data, although maybe. But then SOE chapter is going to be a thorny issue there. So we don't really know if China's gonna make any progress on its accession to the CPTPP, but I will welcome if China trying to, really align its practice with more of the, the high level, high standard international rules, and I think that's that's beneficial to China too, even if it end up not joining the CPTPP. Its relations with the EU, we've seen both sides seem to willing to, there are signs that they may reach an agreement on the dispute over EVs. So we saw China recently postpone its trade remedy investigations on EU brandy. So maybe there's something tangible there. There are also renewed calls for reviving the comprehensive agreement on investment with the EU. Now, there are still a lot of concerns within EU about China's industrial policy, its overcapacity issues, Ukraine war, and China's relations with Russia is going to be another problem. So those are all obstacles, but I see there's effort for China to trying to overcome them and at least have more like to build a stronger, closer relations with EU. And then over the past few years, we continue to see China push for the FTA with the Gulf Cooperation Council and sign some deals with the Arab countries, such as UAE and Saudi Arabia. With Africa, China continues to have this forum on China-Africa cooperation and advocating for this framework agreement on China-Africa economic partnership and trying to push on deals on market access, investment, technology transfer, especially in energy and manufacture and natural resources, which I think China will have a heavy reliance on Africa. So those are our carrots. Sticks, and I think Henry mentioned that the statement from MOFCOM to warn against any deal making with the U.S. that would undermine China's interest. Now, China over the past few years, China has developed its legal tools for sanctions, export controls, and also various type of investigations that could lead to some kind of trade or investment restrictive measures. But that remains to be seen. So I've talked to some folks in Asian countries. The feedback I got is they don't really want to be put in this position. I think they will trying to navigate very carefully out of this delicate spot where on one hand they economically relies on China a lot, and then on the other hand they have a security partnership with the US. So I'd say we have a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions about what's going to happen, but at least those are the factors currently in place. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. That's a great note to end on because I've got tons of questions, and there are some that have been going through the chat box and the Q&A. Henry, let me direct one to you first. So if we take your analysis as given of the kind of strategy behind why we're seeing the US behaving as it is, the objectives, the geostrategic objectives, what does it mean for the WTO and the multilateral trading system? And then second question, what does it mean for third countries? So you mentioned rules of origin and all this sort of thing. If we're moving towards a world where rules of origin are potentially getting quite strict with the use of Chinese content, is that, again, how does that sit with third countries that have been working, in some cases, both with the US and China? Thinking of partners in Africa, for example, where both countries have been pretty busy in promoting private sector development in different ways, admittedly. But yeah, those two things. Where does this leave the WTO system, and what do we think about the effects on third countries? You're muted, Henry.
Sorry. Thanks, Ben, and the audience for that question. So I guess one uncomfortable truth that we have to face now is that the old system is no more, unfortunately, right? As we trade lawyers all know, one of the most fundamental principles of the WTO is the MFN principle, right? And the national treatment principle. But if you look at all these non-discrimination principles, what they do is basically that they only focus on the so-called like products. without caring much about how these products are made, or in WTO jargon, what are the so-called process and production methods, right? Or the PPM. So under current WTO rules, you are not supposed to discriminate products based on the product and process and production methods. So the focus should be on the end products, not the conditions under which it was produced, even if these conditions might involve, let's say, forced labor, pollution, or corruption, and so on. So this system, unfortunately, I don't think it can continue anymore, because we have already seen, right, from the U.S.-China trade war, that is basically what the U.S. is after, right? The fact that, if you read the Liberation Day executive order, actually the executive order explicitly mentioned several times that China is using, practices such as suppressing consumption as a way to gain unfair advantage in international trade. So by denying your people, salary or wage raises, and giving them very low salaries so that they can continue to work as cheap labor, basically 40 plus years after China opens up to the rest of the world, China was able to gain this unfair advantage. And this cannot be continued anymore. So I would expect that we, if there are law students out there, in the audience, so what you have learned in your trade law WTO class, might not be valid anymore 10 years, from now, because we are witnessing the start of new system where we will look at not just the products, how these iPhones, what this iPhone look like, but also how this iPhone is made, right? Who are the workers who make this? Are they paid fair wages, right? Are they working under humane conditions? Do they have basic social welfare, and so on, right? So these are all the questions that will be taken into account, and I think that's how the new agreements will be like. And to the other countries other than U.S. and China, well, I guess the choice is yours, right? You can decide to join the U.S. or to join China. But the fact is that, I think the equation is very simple. The U.S. remains as the world's largest consumer, and China remains as the world's largest producer, right? So who do you want to sell your products to? Well, I think the answer is very clear. Yeah. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Fair enough. Thank you. We're getting close to time. Let me direct one question. I'm actually going to pinch this from Hannah. I hope you don't mind. I hope you haven't copyrighted this approach. But what I'm actually going to do is ask each of our speakers if there was one thing they could say to a policymaker to summarize their advice at this moment, what would it be? But to make it a little more sort of fun, I'm going to ask Huan what she would say to a US policymaker if she could walk into the White House or USTR right now and give them one piece of advice, what would it be? And for Henry, I'm going to ask the question, if you could walk into MOFCOM in China and give them one piece of advice, what would it be? So Huan, maybe I'll start with you.
Wow, that's a tough one. If I walk into the White House right now, I would say, um, get your policy, get your priorities straight. Because right now, there are a lot of questions within the US, within DC, but also I can only imagine with the countries coming to have negotiations with the US, what the US want, right? Because you can't really get to the goal unless you have a clear roadmap. And the same happens with China too. Like if you want China to change something, unless it's just completely decoupling, then there's no reason to have any kind of deal. But if there's any hope that the US wanted China to make changes, then you need to have very clear agenda. Because right now, nobody has a clue, and that's really counterproductive to reaching any kind of US policies.
Okay, I'm going to chime in and say I think that's great advice. I'm sure you saw this as well in the press that the Japanese negotiating team walked out of their not walked out in the sense of left in a huff, but they left their meeting with the US saying we don't have a clue what they want from us. So yes, really good advice for any policy situation. Let's be clear on the objectives before we start choosing mechanisms. I think that's excellent advice. So Henry, if you could walk into MOFCOM, what would you say to them?
Well, actually, I would give exactly the same advice as Juan gave them to get their priorities right, But instead of walking to MOFCOM, which I sometimes do, I would say this time around, I might have to be granted access to the Zhongnanhai compound where the Politburo is, because ultimately this is not an economic or legal question. It is a political question. These are top level decisions that has to be made by the Politburo, whether they want to, as I said, share more of the gains from the economic development with the people. I don't think MOFCOM can decide that, right? The MOFCOM can revise the trade law, right? Can implement these trade laws, but to decide these fundamental distribution issues, it is up to the Politburo. So unless the Politburo make a decision to say that we are going to distribute, more to the people, also, and also to provide them with a basic social safety net, like healthcare, cheap housing, and so on, I don't think the problem will be solved. So ultimately, it boils down, to whether the political bureau would have the political will to address this issue, and I hope they do, because when they do, it's not going to be good. Not only going to be good for the Chinese people themselves, but also for the American people and for all the people in the world, because the world would be more balanced, right? We will see the rise of a more prosperous China where the people are richer. They can enjoy the fruits of their labor, right, after 40 years of reform, because essentially, I mean, that's you saw what happening, right, in other Asian countries, in Japan, in Korea, right, in Singapore, for example, after many years of economic development, where they also started with, basically low-skill jobs like textiles and clothing industry, right? And then gradually, as the economy develops, the people get richer and richer, right? Until you see all these, rich Japanese tourists everywhere in the world, right? I mean, today we are not seeing that to China. There are some rich people in China, but most people, as mentioned by Premier Li, in 2020, about half of the population still earns less than $5 a day. So how can they consume? If you deduct everything, the housing, the healthcare, the food, and everything, they barely leave anything to consume. So unless this problem is solved, we are not going to solve this imbalance problem.
Good advice also, Henry. Thank you. And what I take away from that is when the problem is political and geostrategic, recognize it as such. So we're using economic policy as if I understand your argument correctly, we're using economic policy as a tool here to get to a broader sort of political macroeconomic settlement. So I think that's it's an interesting perspective, and it's definitely good to keep that in mind. I'll just raise for people listening out there. In the Q&A, reference was made to a debate that's been going on about this kind of rebalancing. So there's economists on both sides of it, as there always are, and so that's worth looking into. So Michael Pettis on one side, and it was Murray Obsfeld on the other side. And so you can look on social media to find that. We also had questions about whether or not there's a paper with Henry's presentation. Henry, I think you put up all the information for that in your slide. Henry's very active on X, so if you want to follow him there, you can see what he thinks. And there are those couple of articles that he put details of in the slide. For anyone who wants to check it up, there were references there in the chat box, and it'll also be available on the recording. Hannah, we've got a minute left. What's your take?
Well, I would just like to throw out a question for anybody who would like to answer, because there's so much drama, there's so much darkness. Like, is there a silver lining to all of this? Is there a silver lining? Now I heard Henry was sort of touching on it. Juan, is there a silver lining to all of this? And Ben, you can answer the question too.
Well, if this trade war leads China to liberalize its market more, either in services to trade or, in other sectors, strengthen up its IP protection, labor rules, then I think that's a silver lining.
Yeah. Henry?
Yeah, actually, I have to emphasize that boosting consumption is not just the demands of the U.S., it's China's own goal. If you recall, ever since 2020, the Chinese government has been calling for the so-called dual circulation, right? The idea is that we should reduce reliance on exports and focus more on domestic consumption. But 5 years have passed and this is not happening. Why? Because the distribution system has not changed. So if anything, I hope that this new trade war can, really motivate the leadership, the Politburo, to have a closer look at the distribution system and redistribute more of the economic wealth to the people. And if that happens, then that will be the silver lining.
Ben?
God, Hannah, I asked the questions. I don't have to answer them. Look, if I were to, so, I'm sitting here in the United States. I do think it's going to get worse before it gets better. That's my take. But if I want to find a silver lining, I do think that over time, the US is going to, and others around the world are going to reassess the value of a vibrant multilateral trading system. I think we're going to learn a lot about that over the next couple of years. I'm a committed multilateralist. I started studying the WTO system 30 years ago. 30 years ago this year, actually. And so my hope for a silver lining, if I allow myself a little optimism, is that we come to appreciate the value of that again, with all of its failings, which I think have been rightly pointed out during the presentation. So Hannah, what's your silver lining?
No, I was close to that actually, because we had Hamid Mamdouh from the WTO, ex-WTO, and I think he phrased it perfectly. He said, looking at not the WTO for the future, but the future. Well, I screwed that up. So instead of the future of the WTO, to look at the WTO for the future. And to really, like you say, assess the value and not take that for granted. And for multilateralism and for collaboration and for global growth in general. So making that pie bigger and, being better at also distributing it. So a lot of things that we take for granted. Ben, you have some news for us coming up in June, no?
Yeah, so, well, let me first thank our speakers. That was a really, really interesting session. So, thank you so much, Henry and Juan, for sharing your views so generously with us and with our audience. We really appreciate it. There was a lot of insight there, a lot of challenging issues and questions, and I think that's exactly the sort of thing that we're trying to do in these sessions. So thank you very much. Thank you to our audience. If you'd like to come back and join us next month for our May webinar, we'll be having a paper on ASEAN and India value chains by Sowen Ray with the discussant, my colleague and friend Ha from ERIA will be talking about that. So that'll be on May 29th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Again, keep an eye on LinkedIn. Keep an eye on our mailing list if you'd like to stay up to date on that. But with that, Hannah, thank you, as always, partner in crime. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to our really great audience for being with us today with their kind attention and also lots of really interesting questions. We'll see you guys back here next month.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. I love seeing the chat blowing up, the Q&A box.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.